Well, what a privilege it is to be with everybody this evening. My goodness, this is a special day. We're going to be talking about something that all of us already know about. It's about the Dublan Passover, and it happened on March 13th, 1916. And today is the 106th anniversary of that date. And so we hope that reliving this anniversary and going over some of these things will give us an opportunity to relive some of the feelings and thoughts that we've had and recognize the great heritage that we do have. This is the references that I use to be able to get the presentation. The book that was written by my mother here, the diary of Ernest Young, who was a counselor to Anson Bowen Call and was there present. This is a collection of stories which contains also the life story of Anson Bowen Call. Many of you are aware that Julia, Anson's wife, wrote up the occurrence, and it was printed in the 1921 improvement era. And so this is a copy of the outside. You can go on the inside. The article is called "Why Did They Turn?" This up here is a book of written by Carole Call King, who is with us this evening, on her father, who is Anson Bowen Call Jr. And then down in the lower right, a book written by Friedrich Katz about the life and times of Pancho Villa, and another book by that. Both of them are recognized. I mean, he is a recognized authority on Pancho Villa. This is a graphic showing the original nine colonies that were in effect in 1912. And in July 29th, they had to be evacuated because of being threatened by the revolutionists. There were approximately 4,500 people living in the colonies, and they all evacuated. The Calls at that point had lived in Mexico for 22 years. This is a familiar story to all of us. I hope that no one is hearing this for the first time. It's something that should be shared, and it's been one that has built faith in our families. I feel and can still hear my mother telling me about this story, and she was there present. And it's one that we need to continue to remember, and we need to continue to share with our children and family and others. When I was stake president, my mother was here, and I had her share it with our stake in a stake conference one time. So our stake here has heard the story from my mother. I think it's also a story that we need to apply to ourselves. And as I have been preparing this, and also we've been doing the Come Follow Me about Abraham, I've asked myself, how did Anson able to develop the faith that he had? What went on in his life that allowed him to have the kind of faith that he had? How was he able to go through the trials that he faced? And there were a lot of them. And how was he able to have the courage to, when he received an impression, to follow it? And I think those are good questions to ponder. They're things that we can talk about with our families, and they're things that help our faith to grow, to see what's happened with our ancestors, and especially someone we're all directly related to. So once again, these are the books. They were to come up individually. That's why my slide wasn't. But so there's people that have told the story so many times it gets distorted a little bit. So I went back to the original versions, and I think we'll have a fun time tonight reviewing that. So Anson went to Dublan, Colonia Dublan, in November of 1890. and there were originally 9 colonies at that time. As I mentioned, there was a mass exodus of the colonies. The Calls had lived there for 22 years. Most of the colonists did not return to Mexico, but after 11 months, conditions allowed families to start returning. Most of them that went back to Colonia Juarez and Colonia Dublan. And in June of 1913, Anson Call and his families returned to Colonia Dublan. They had been in Bountiful, and that's when the children, all of our grandparents, were able to meet their grandparents, Thompsons and Mariah Bowen, where they stayed in Bountiful. So in late 1913, there were 2 factions that were still fighting against the Federalists of the then President Huerta of the Republic. They were known as Constitutionalists. One force was led by Venustiano Carranza, and the other one was led by Pancho Villa. They were both kind of working together to fight against the federal government at that time. Pancho Villa had made his temporary headquarters in Ascension, which is north of Dublan. And it was that time in mid-August that the Calls, he was moving south to Chihuahua, and that was the first meeting that the Calls had with Pancho Villa. He had an encounter with the Call family, and Julia wrote her mother, Grandma Doan, we called her, about what happened. Villa stopped by and asked the Calls for some watermelon. Julia wrote that Bowen's crop wasn't very good, so he took General Villa across the street to where Tom Jones was because he had some good watermelons. She reported in her letter to her mother, he was very jolly and asked if he could come back for grapes if he came the next day. Well, he didn't come back for grapes because the army went on south, but their first encounter with Pancho Villa was a very good one. In November of 1913, the Red Flaggers, that the colonists called them, were marauding factions of rebels that weren't really associated with anybody, but they would go around and loot and rob other people. At that time, Anson Bowen Call was taken at gunpoint to this hacienda in San Diego. There he was taken out to be shot, and they said uno, dos, and then they stopped and said that if he would provide a ransom that they would let him go, and he promised that he would do it, and they went with him as he collected the ransom in Colonia Juarez. Then in late April, the situation in the colonies became very tense. And President Smith in Salt Lake telegraphed and said, it's our advice to rush word to Joseph Bentley, that was the state president, to warn our people to get out of Mexico as soon as possible. So this began the second exodus for Mexico, for the colonists. On April 25th, 1914, the Call family left by train. Theresa and her family and Clela left, and then Julia, and she was pregnant with Ola. After 7 months, the conditions improved again, and the Calls set out to return. By 1915 in May, there was enough families that had returned to Dublan that to justify, and I was told that everybody in Dublan says it Dublan, and if you say it with a Spanish accent, it's Dublan, so it's probably Dublan, to establish a ward. Elder Anthony W. Ivins, who had lived in the colonies, was a member of the Quorum of the 12, and he came and presided over that special priesthood meeting. Grandpa was called to be a bishop at age 51 in May. And his counselors were W. Ernest Young and Nephi W. Thane. Bowen had previously served in a bishopric for 13 years. And when he was finally released, he had served 29 years as a bishop and had been in a bishopric for 43 years. So his life was full of service. In 1915, Pancho Villa had been controlling the north, and they were concerned about skirmishes that might go across the border. And so they had a conference in El Paso with General Hugh Scott and Pancho Villa. And you can see here's General Scott and here's Pancho Villa walking out of the conference. And this was the height of Villa's power. Later on in 1915, Villa and Carranza had a parting. Villa felt that Carranza was not moving toward the principles that they had been fighting for. They wanted to move away from a monarch. They wanted to establish a constitutional government. They wanted to allow the common people to own land. At that time, all of the land in Chihuahua, where the colonies were, was owned by 3 people. And the common people couldn't own the land, and they couldn't afford it. Their children weren't allowed to be educated. There wasn't freedom of the press, and the women weren't allowed to vote. So these were the things that actually Pancho Villa was fighting for, and he got upset that Carranza wasn't doing that. So he announced his intention to overtake the new Carranza regime, who had just declared himself president. So he started a march, and his army was known as the Division of the North. And he started his march south to attack Mexico City. His advance was halted by several disastrous defeats that he had, and he had to retreat again to the north. He then devised another plan. He decided to move all of his remaining men and his material by railroad to Nuevo Casas Grandes, which is what everybody calls the station, and to Colonia Dublan for a large campaign to gather strength. They were going to meet in Colonia Dublan, and they were going to cross Pulpit Pass and then go over to Agua Prieta and overwhelm the Carranza garrison there. Then from there, they were going to march south down the coastal states and then sweep inward toward Mexico City. So that was his plan. And in late September, I remember Mother telling me that troops came in by the trainload, just one train after another bringing troops in. And it was estimated there were more than 10,000 people that came into the little colony town of Colonia Dublan. They traveled with their wives, they traveled with their children. Mom said that they had monkeys and pets and dogs. They were just everywhere. And they stayed there. Bowen allowed the Villa and his generals to set up headquarters in the tithing office. And I wish they'd have taken more pictures, but somehow we were able to get this picture of the Villistas in the tithing house in Dublan. They stayed there for 3 weeks, and this is what Anson Bowen Call said. Be it said to their credit that during the 22 days of stay, this multitude of men, armed men, and camp followers, not a man, woman, or child was molested, injured, or insulted among us. During their stay, we continued with our meetings and Sunday school. Not a house was broken into. Villa maintained perfect discipline. He was a master of the situation. So they stayed there 3 weeks and had no problems at all with Villa. They helped provide them the tithing house. They sold them the grain and the hay to feed their horses from the tithing area. And he paid them in Villa money, which Mother said ended up being worthless. But anyway, they wanted to pay for it. And it was a good situation during that time between both the colonists and Villa and his army. He left Colonia Dublan and marched towards Agua Prieta. He had about 6,000 troops. He dismissed the wives and that they didn't. They had to go over and through a pass. There was no railroad to go over there, so the wives and other people went back to Chihuahua City, And he felt like he was going to have an easy victory of his 6,000 troops against a garrison of 1,200 troops. But something happened. The United States government allowed the Carranza forces to transport reinforcements and arms over to Agua Prieta from El Paso. This happened on U.S. foreign soil over U.S. rail lines. So this is an actual picture of the rail lines of the troop train that went to Agua Prieta. And these were fresh veteran troops. In Katz's book, he said that some of them had fought against Villa in that big battle that he lost in the South, and they had time to prepare, and they felt like they could defeat him again. So the battle was actually a massacre by ambush. Villa usually attacked at night. He had done that down south, and that was his way of doing things. His men had their night vision with their eyes, and they felt that they could actually do better by attacking at night. He'd won a lot of victories at night. But he found that instead of the 1,200 people that he was expecting, there were 6,000 troops waiting for him. There were 2 searchlights that were used to light up the area. And so that made his cavalry an easy target for the machine guns as they were strategically placed. They had dug deep trenches like they used to in World War I, and they well protected the enemy from a traveling cavalry. There were machine guns nests set up very strategically, and that was a huge disadvantage to him. All of this unexpected, and electric barbed wire was set up. So what was the aftermath of all that? After the battle, what was to be an easy victory had turned into a devastating loss. There were heavy losses in his army. Morale became low, and more than 1,500 people deserted his army. His army was now numbered in hundreds instead of thousands. And this led to a complete change in Villa's attitude toward the United States and anything American. Now, it's interesting to me that as I've read some of these other accounts, they don't talk about all of this great loss. They just say that Carranza's people were able to go across Texas and New Mexico and have reinforcements. But can you imagine Villa sitting and watching his whole army get mowed down by machine guns and people that were waiting for them, and he was only thinking it was going to be about 1,200 people? I mean, to me, it would have been devastating to watch your whole army just get mowed down by something that you weren't even expecting to take place. So Villa had considered himself a friend of the Americans, and now his whole attitude had changed because he watched basically his whole army disappear right before his eyes, and he wanted revenge for what he felt like should have never happened and should have never been allowed on foreign soil for foreign troops to be transported across there in doing that. So what was left of his army retreated south through Hermosillo, and then they went back to the Chihuahua City area. And he told his troops that they could leave, they could stay with him, they could do what they wanted. A corps of about 500 of them decided to stay with him. And then that happened in November, and he got these men together and went back up north to Columbus, and his army of about 500 raided the U.S. garrison in Columbus, New Mexico. Now, this was an attack on the U.S. soil from a Mexican army. So you can imagine what happened. By the way, that's an actual photograph of what happened, of the destruction and the fire that had taken place in Columbus from the archives. Now, the raid on U.S. soil traveled fast, and the steady stream of dispatches went everywhere. And of course, it reached Salt Lake City, and it greatly concerned the leaders of the church. Pancho Villa's army was headed south, and he had vowed to kill every American in his path. And when you understand exactly how bad his defeat was, and that he felt that it was totally the fault of the United States, you can see why he was so upset, and why anything American now became his enemy. So the word reached the colonies that his army was coming south and was heading towards Dublan. Now, the first presidency, after they had gotten the reports, telegraphed Bishop Hurst in El Paso. And I learned by putting this together that Bishop Hurst, his son, Roy, married Mildred. And so those of you who are descendants of Mildred, Anson's daughter, this is Mildred's father-in-law, and he was bishop in El Paso, and he did whatever he could. Was asked to do whatever he could by the first presidency to help them from being trapped in Colonia Dublan and Colonia Juarez. So he went across the border to Ciudad Juarez, and this is interesting because we have Ciudad Juarez, which is across from El Paso, and we have Colonia Juarez, which is down in the colonies. But he went across the border from El Paso to secure trains. To escape to the south was not possible because Villa's army had burned bridges south of Casas Grandes. So the only way they could go would be to travel by train to El Paso. The problem was that they would need a military escort to be able to do that, because if Villa's armies reached the railroad tracks at Corralitos or along that way, they would be sitting ducks for them to stop the train and massacre everybody on board. So it was decided that the only way that could happen was to have a military escort. So on Saturday, Bishop Hurst telegraphed the first presidency that everything was all set up. They had talked to Dublan and Pearson. Pearson was the railroad station south and east a little bit of Colonia Juarez, and they would have boxcars all ready to go, and all they needed was the escort. He said, "We'll keep you posted." So the troop train didn't arrive on Saturday or on Sunday. By Sunday evening, the telegraph lines went dead. And that was feared that Villa and his men had reached the railroad tracks and were now nearing Dublan. The Deseret News on March 12th reported the train, which was to carry the Mormons from their colony near Casas Grandes, had not yet started out and will not start out until a sufficient escort arrives from the garrison at Chihuahua City. So they had to go all the way from Chihuahua City up to El Paso, get on the train and go down to the colonies. And the commandant there said that we're not going to do anything until we have a military escort. So Villa's army reached Hacienda Corralitos, which was 16 miles north of Dublan. And it was a large American-owned ranch there. When they heard Pancho Villa was coming, they fled and they left the ranch in charge of the Mexicans. One of the first things that Villa did was to summon a group of these ill-fated Mexicans and inform them that they were to be shot because they'd been found on American property. This is a quote from Raymond J. Reed, who did his master's thesis on Villa and on Pershing's involvement in this. So what happened was that they were lined up. Several of they said the people in the colony said it was the Palacio brothers. They were lined up and shot. And others were turned loose. They were to inform any of the Mexicans that they were found on American property that they would be shown no more regard than Americans themselves. So Raymond J. Reed said that these Mexicans fled Corralitos and they reached Dublan, informing them that what had happened at the hacienda and of Villa's threats that were coming. So this is from Anson Bowen Call's life history, and it says, word came to us from the colonies that Villa was coming and he was continuing to slaughter all Americans. Can you imagine how they felt? They'd heard rumors. They'd been trying to get train passage out to be able to escape. That train hadn't come. And then the Mexicans came down from Corralitos and told them that they'd had several people executed by a firing squad, and Villa was on his way. So Bishop Call asked for an emergency priesthood meeting to be held at the home of Gaskell Romney. The men discussed what they should do, and they really understood the seriousness of the situation. There were several alternatives. That escape by railroad was now out of the question. Some of them suggested they could go down to Casas Grandes, which was a little south, about 5 miles south, and there was a small garrison that the Carranza military were manning, but they felt like they would be overrun by Villa's army anyway. They could go to Colonia Juarez and then head up into the mountains, but Villa had been abandoned in the mountains before the revolution, and he knew the mountains very well, and it wouldn't be hard for him to flush out a group of people trying to escape. Others suggested they could go down to the lakes, but the lakes are flat. They're easy to pick out a group of people trying to go somewhere. There was no easy solution. Everything they were talking about had flaws. And there was no clear way to avoid a catastrophe. So it was decided that Bishop Call and John Whetton, who was a counselor in the stake presidency, and Harvey Taylor would go to ask State President Bentley for advice. Mother said that they went in Brother Harvey Taylor's car because it was the only car that was there that was running in Colonia Dublan. And it was easier for them to take that car than to try to go by horseback. So they traveled the 16 miles to Colonia Juarez in his car to talk with President Bentley. The saints in Dublan, and this is something that I just found this time by reading in the book that Carole Call King wrote, that Anson reported that the saints were fasting during the time that the three men went to see President Bentley in Juarez. So they were all hoping for some kind of a direction that President Bentley could provide for them. Those that remained back in Colonia Dublan, they began to pack so they could be ready to go at a moment's notice. By mid-afternoon, they had no word from the men that had gone to visit President Bentley. Now, in the Call households, Mother said that there was constant prayer mingled with preparation. She said the unknown was hard to cope with, but Aunt Theresa, Mother, and the older girls had a discussion, and then we went to work in earnest. So I have here pictures of the older girls, which was Clella and Mildred, and their mother, Theresa, and then Julia. Clella's mother wasn't there, that's right. But those were the three girls Theresa had helped raise Clella. With calmness and bravery, Mother said they prepared to go into hiding to escape Villa or to die according to the will of the Lord. So this was what was going through my mother's mind as they were starting to prepare. This is a picture a year or two later, but at the time that this took place, my mother was 9, Lorna and her sister Ola was 2, and Era was 6. So this was taken 2 years later. So, but this is the only picture I had, but it kind of lets you know what these children must have been thinking about when their father was gone and their mother was telling them, we got to be prepared to leave. We don't know where we're going, and we may have to stay and be killed. The boys, who were Anson Jr., he was 15, Gaius was 14, Charlie was 14, Waldo was 12, and Villa 11. They brought the light wagon around to the front of the house, and both families were busily packing. And Mother said, we knew not what Father would have us do. We had to wait for him. So you can imagine they hadn't heard from him. It was getting late. They were waiting everybody to find out what was going on. By sunset, there was still no sign of them coming back from Colonia Juarez. They had had men to the north of Dublan standing guard and watching for Villa's coming. And by that evening, no train had come, but about 8 o'clock, Harvey Taylor's car came into town. So everybody gathered around at Gaskell Romney's home, some of them with wagons all packed, ready to leave, just wondering what they would be asked to do and where they would be led. Bishop Call, along with the two brethren that went with him, were immediately surrounded by people eager to know what President Bentley had told them to do. President Bentley, this is a quote from Anson Bowen Call's book, Life History. He said, "President Bentley told us that we knew the conditions better than he and to do as we think best." You can imagine, those of you that have served a bishop say, you got to go to the stake president hoping that you get the direction, and he says, "Bishop, you take care of it." So Bishop Call listened to the various proposals that had been discussed while the three men were away. Just about everyone expected to vacate the town. There were a few that thought that they had some guns and that they should try to stay and fight. All opinions were heard, and Bishop Call had his turn to speak. I can only imagine what was going on. Standing there thoughtfully for a few minutes, he raised his head and looked around at all the anxious faces. And I think all of us could probably quote this. "I feel impressed. You should go back to your homes, pray, blow out our lights, and go to bed." Now, you can imagine there was a moment of stunned silence. One man spoke up. "That's a hell of a thing to tell us to do." You can imagine that. I mean, that's just a natural reaction. Brother Whetton was standing next to Bishop Call. He said, "Bishop Call has been prompted to tell us what to do. Let's do it." Another man that was there was Joseph Moffat. He came forward. He said, "That's the word of the Lord to me." And he started through the crowd in the direction of his home. Others followed, and the wagons turned homeward. Bowen gathered his family together at Aunt Thressa's home, and they were all gathered together in family prayer. I have heard Mother talk about that prayer many times. And she wrote, "He really talked to the Lord, telling him how we loved him, that we were trying to show him by keeping his commandments, and we needed his protection that night. We now commit ourselves into thy hands for thy care and keeping for this night and always. Thy will be done. May we be prepared to meet thee, and may we be exalted in thy celestial kingdom." That night, the guards were all pulled in from Colonia Dublan. Mildred said, in a quote from Mildred, "We slept better than we had in nights. Brother Bentley had told Papa that he, as bishop of the ward, would have the inspiration to make the right decision. And the Lord did inspire him and blessed him." They found out later that the first presidency had been very concerned about this, and that Elder Anthony W. Ivins had gone to the Salt Lake Temple and had been fasting and praying for them at the very time that this was taking place. Well, what happened? That night, Pancho Villa's men were in Hacienda Corralitos, and about midnight they left, and they rode 6 miles. This would have been to the east to the cattle loading facility. And along the railroad tracks, there was a from Corralitos, there was a wagon road that paralleled that. And they followed that down, and they came to the cattle corrals on the outskirts of Dublan about 3 o'clock in the morning. This was Villa's way of attacking. He always attacked at night, not always, but many of his attacks were at night, and he felt like that gave him a real good advantage. So they arrived there about 3 a.m. Then, unaccountably, the entire army turned toward the east and rode away without even disturbing or entering the town. No one even knew when he came or what had happened until the morning. Early in the morning, someone came to Bishop Call and told him that Villa's army had already come, and they'd bypassed the town and gone eastward and then on towards Chocolate Pass, which is over in the Galiana Valley. He went and Joseph Moffat, had a buggy, and they drove off and found Villa's trail and followed it for some time. It went to the east of the cemetery. Those of you that have been there, they would have gone past the cemetery to the east of there and headed off towards Galiana through Chocolate Pass. At first, the residents of Dublan were at a loss to explain what had happened, only that they had been spared, except that they knew that the Lord had answered their prayers. Bishop Call wrote to Elder Ivans a week or two later after the event, and he said, the news of the Columbus raid struck us like a thunderbolt out of the clear blue sky. Next, we heard about his whereabouts, that he was at La Ascensión, and the next night at Corralitos. You can imagine how we felt when we heard this, his expression of hatred for everything American. Villa and his notorious band passed almost through the colony at night, having crossed the railroad tracks at the stock pens and then continued to the reservoirs, leaving us unmolested. There are many rumors afloat as to why he did not visit us. We know why he didn't. The God of heaven worked upon him in answer not only to our prayers, but to the thousands and thousands of faithful saints. We feel that no greater miracle has been wrought in the history of the Mormon Church than this. And on that following Sunday, Bishop Call presided over a special assembly that they gathered together to give God thanks for his intervention in saving them and the town. Now later, they learned the real reason as to what happened when Villa bypassed Dublan. They understood that something miraculously had happened, but they needed to. Everybody really wanted to know why, what happened. In his life story, Bowen said this: that night, Villa's army came in as far as the cattle chutes at Corralitos, then went east and into the mountains. We slept well all night and did not know they came. Some of Villa's men told Brother Nephi Thane, that was his counselor, sometime later, that when they got to the cattle corrals, this was just north of Dublan, they saw bright lights all over, and they could see men walking back and forth, armed, and they were afraid to come into the town and attack as they had planned to do. As far as I know, there wasn't a light on in the town. So what a wonderful thing, what a great thing. And 25 years later, we have Ruth at age 16, and her brothers Arnold and Erin were coming back from El Paso on the train together. And I've asked Barbara Evans, Ruth's daughter, to tell us what her mother was told as she was riding the train back from El Paso. This was 25 years later. So Barbara, can you unmute your
yep.
and help us? Thank you. There's Barbara.
I'm ready, and thanks for asking me to do this. This is fairly brief. In the summer of 1941, Arnold, Erin, and I traveled by train to El Paso to visit Lorna. She bought us school clothes and me my junior prom dress. I had my eyes checked and received my first glasses. The movie Brigham Young was playing in El Paso, and Lorna let us go see it Sunday afternoon, since that was the only opportunity that we would have to see it. On our return trip home, a Mexican man who was also on the train struck up a conversation with us. He asked us where we were going. I told him we lived in Colonia Dublan and were returning there. He responded, "Yes, I know of Colonia Dublan. How well I remember. I was there with Villa the night he and his troops were intending to destroy the town and its people. But Villa saw bright lights in town and saw men marching through the streets. He was afraid to attack the community as planned. We were ordered to change our course and move quickly to the east, bypassing Dublan. I told him that my parents had told me about that night." The end.
You know, isn't that neat that, Ruth was born after this situation, but she knew the story. They told everybody this story. That's why I say, I hope everybody doesn't ever tire of telling this story. It's a story of faith. It's a story of courage. Anson Bowen Call Jr. wrote about his feelings as witnessing this as a 15-year-old, and I've asked his daughter, Carole Call King, to tell us a little bit about some of his feelings. Carole? Thank you, Barbara. Appreciate that. Carole, you may need to unmute.
I always loved hearing Daddy tell this story, and he told it a lot. And I'm just going to read the words he told me to put in his book. To me, this was a miracle, showing the Lord's intervention to help his people. The people had fasted and prayed they would not be harmed. Because of Father's calling as bishop, he had the right to inspiration from the Lord in their behalf, and they followed his counsel. If it hadn't been for the prayers, the priesthood, and the guidance of the Lord, I think we all would have been massacred, because we had no guns or ammunition or anything at that time to protect ourselves. This incident has always been faith promoting in my life. The next morning, as most curious kids would do, remember he was 15, I got on my horse and rode with Charlie and some others to see if we could find any trace of the army. We could see where all the horses had crossed the railroad tracks and headed east. We followed the horse tracks a while, and some of us picked up things the soldiers had dropped along the way. I found an indelible pencil. I was going to keep it as a souvenir, but I didn't keep it very long before it was gone. Several of the other boys picked up a few little things, and it was the same way with them. But Daddy never forgot that miracle. Thanks for asking me, Francis.
Well, what a, you know, here's a 15-year-old boy. Can you just see those boys going off down, trying to see if they can still see the army? I wondered where they went. I just loved listening, hearing that story. But you know, and I appreciate you saying that, Carole. We've got here Ruth, her daughter, Barbara, who Ruth wasn't even born when this happened, and yet it was very, very dear to Ruth and to Aaron and to all of the children that weren't even born. There were other children that were Ethel and Athelia and Ivis and Cleo had left the home. They were married, but there isn't one of them that hasn't told this same story. It happened to their father. It happened to us as his descendants. We look at this as something that is dear to us because we know that it happened and we know the Lord intervened on their behalf. I just put this down there. Do you remember how you felt the first time you heard probably your father or your grandfather or someone tell this story? Everybody had heard about Pancho Villa, and yet to tell this story just swells up inside. When I was mission president in Chile, I told this to my missionaries. I told it in a district conference in Chile, and the people were excited to hear the great things that the Lord had done to us now, and not back in Bible times, but in the near future. And it happened to my mother. It happened to Carole's father. It happened to many of us have because of our descendancy. It's important that we reverence this. And last time when we were having a family reunion, William Call said, we have a dinner every year and celebrate the Dublan Passover. And I just felt like we needed to have, this is the 106th anniversary of that day, and that it would be a good time to have a family reunion by Zoom. We're being joined by Lou's daughter, Carole, over in the Dominican Republic, is with us tonight. So this is a wonderful thing that we can remember. And the Lord has asked us to remember things that have happened to us. That's why Passover happens among the Jews, for them to remember their being saved from the Egyptian army. And we have a modern story of that in our own family. I wanted to close with this quote from Dieter F. Uchtdorf. He said, following the Savior will not remove all your trials. However, it will remove the barriers between you and the help your Heavenly Father wants to give you. God will be with you. He will direct your footsteps. He will walk beside you and even carry you when your need is greatest. And as I have pondered the things that have taken place to Anson Bowen Call in his life, being taken out to be shot, we'll have another PowerPoint on that one sometime. But Mother said that he was weak. He was in bed for 3 days afterwards, after being taken out to be shot. It had such an effect on him. But yet he had faith that the Lord would protect him. And but he tried him right to the very last minute, because it was difficult. And you can imagine the courage it took for him to have the impression to have people go home and turn out their lights and having all of their welfare at hand. And yet, having felt those impressions previously, having trust in the Lord, was able to say that to everyone else. Go home, turn out your lights, the Lord will bless us. So what a great family we belong to, and we have a tradition of a great heritage, and I hope that we never forget this, and that on the 16th, that's the 13th.
Yeah,
On the 13th of March, every year we do remember the Dublan Passover. And I am privileged to have been able to share this with you, and I hope we can have some comments from other people, and appreciate everyone that has been here this evening. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.